News now.
Okay, so our news segment today is going to explore some of the global political consequences, and you could call it the fallout, because it's been mostly negative, for the Biden administration from Biden's decision to withdraw troops from Afghanistan and end U.S. participation in the war there. And as you know, this decision led to the rapid collapse of the Afghan government and its replacement by a new Taliban government. And the Taliban has moved quickly to consolidate its hold throughout the country and establish a new government that has already begun to reverse many of the liberalizing reforms of the prior regime. All of those changes that the U.S.-supported Afghan government put in is starting to erode here. And the speed of these significant political changes in an important country in Central Asia have raised much larger questions about U.S. leadership in the international political system. It has also raised questions about the decline of U.S. power and influence, the credibility of U.S. alliance commitments to other states in Europe and Asia, and the weakening of domestic political support for President Biden. And so we're going to explore all of these global political consequences in three parts. The first part grounds our presentation today by discussing the historical, economic, military, and political foundations of U.S. global leadership. So we want to take away at least one important thing from this section, this historical overview. And that is this: irrespective of the morality and justice of U.S. hegemony or leadership, or even what some might call U.S. imperialism, U.S. influence is critical to the larger structure of international politics. It helps to create and sustain and shape the content of status quo political orders throughout the world. When the United States then changes this footprint, either by expanding it or by pulling back, as it did in Afghanistan, domestic political orders and regional political orders are renegotiated. They change, oftentimes violently. And so we see this in Afghanistan right now. Second, this withdrawal has been controversial in Europe, provoking frustration on the part of many U.S. allies there, including the United Kingdom. And we will discuss how the changing mission in Afghanistan is putting new strains far away from Afghanistan on that alliance in Europe, NATO, right? And third, we will discuss some of the domestic political fallout from the Afghan withdrawal. President Biden's public support has taken a noticeable dip in the last month, due in large part to the way that withdrawal was handled. So even though the public largely supports the decision to withdraw itself, there is significant frustration in how the withdrawal was executed. This could help to create some future domestic political challenges for President Biden and the Democrats, as the decline in public support has been particularly sharp among political independents, which is the key group of voters who are not tied to either political party in the United States. And these conversations will lead us into our concluding remarks about the domestic foundations of U.S. leadership. So, Pat, do you want to get us started here by talking about the United States and how it's acted to establish many of the components of the contemporary political order?
Yeah, sure. And we want to start the story back in 1945, just as World War II was winding down. As the Allied militaries were in the final stages of defeating Germany and Japan, they began negotiating a series of arrangements to create a new global political order, one that would eliminate future military threats from Germany and Japan, and one that would establish sufficient gains and influence for the victors so that they could justify the enormous national sacrifices they had made during their war to their domestic publics. So the United States, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain and their allies in Western Europe began negotiating a series of arrangements that together constituted or made up this larger global order and continue to shape international politics today. Among others, this order creates a new global economic infrastructure, if you will, of international organizations that would help to restore trade and globalization and rebuild war-torn areas by stimulating U.S. capital exports and foreign aid. So some examples of these organizations include the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the World Bank, the IMF, and perhaps most importantly, the decision on the part of American policymakers to open up U.S. domestic markets to imports from abroad so that countries in Europe could rebuild their economies through exports to the United States. Now, these great powers also carved out what we might call spheres of influence that basically gave them privileged access to smaller countries around the world. And these spheres of influence enabled great powers to shape the domestic political orders of these smaller states and keep out adversarial great powers. And so we see this in the division of Europe between East and West. The Soviet Union carves out a sphere of influence that includes Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria during the Cold War. And we would put in Western Europe, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, West Germany in the US sphere of influence. And that sphere of influence is important because it's essentially an exclusionary pact whereby the great powers agreed to remain outside or leave alone the spheres of countries and the spheres of influence of their adversary. And so these great powers use these spheres of influence to foster political ties, sometimes that included a formal alliance, as within NATO. The United States creates an extensive network of overseas military bases, not only in Western Europe, East Asia, South America, around the world. The great powers use these spheres of influence and this unique ties to influence domestic political outcomes in these countries. So the Soviet Union installs communist parties in power in Eastern Europe that are going to be friendly to their foreign policy interests. Important here in all of this is to realize that US power and influence during the Cold War, Soviet power and influence, shapes the local political order in these places. So it's very hard to talk, even though we might talk about nominal legal independence for, say, West Germany in 1952. The reality of the situation is the United States and US troops on the ground there shaped what domestic political outcomes were possible in West Germany. The United States clearly communicated to the West Germans, we're not going to allow a communist party to take over, and we're not going to allow a new nationalist party like Hitler's Nazi to take over. And so this US influence, this US sphere of influence, shapes the range of domestic political outcomes that are possible.
Same in Japan.
Yes, absolutely, right. In Japan. So this has important implications, and what it means is if these great powers become significant players in a domestic political order of a country within that sphere of influence or in the regional order, if they're major players and then they withdraw, that domestic or regional political order is often remade because the content of that political order had depended in prior terms on the possibility that there was going to be American military intervention. And so we see this in Afghanistan today. An important foundation of American influence in Afghanistan after 9/11 is the stationing of US troops there. Now that footprint had declined over the last couple of years, but this shaped the domestic political order in Afghanistan. It props up the Afghan military, it props up the Afghan government, and what we see is when the United States, when President Biden says, we're withdrawing, we're going to pull our troops out, we're not going to have command of the air anymore, what happens is the Afghan army, even though they had been trained by the United States, they lay down their arms and they decide.
They had all the weapons from the United States.
Yeah, and right? They have all the weapons and they decide not to fight the Taliban. And this is why the Taliban conquers Afghanistan so rapidly. And what was a surprise to intelligence analysts in the United States and around the world was that the Afghan army would decide so quickly not to fight.
And there's a point to be made here about the difference between full withdrawal and everything short of full withdrawal,
Yeah.
right? When the United States has any sort of military presence, even if it's really small and couldn't really realistically fight by itself against the whole Taliban, forces, but it dwindled down to, wasn't ever quite 2,500, but it was pretty close to that. Yeah. That still was a huge difference between getting everybody out. Yeah. Once that sort of threshold was crossed, that's when the psychology and the order itself was unmade, right? Because there's a commitment behind that. It's not just the troops themselves, it's everything that goes with it, right? The air power, and also just this unveiled commitment. We could send more in, right? Once you get all the way out, sending more in is a political
Well, and this is also significant,
right?
too, because U.S. troops on the ground, as Rob said, they're an indicator of the U.S. commitment to the political order there, because those troops are vulnerable to getting killed.
Right.
And so if troops get killed in Afghanistan and it's because there isn't sufficient reinforcements, that opens up the possibility that the footprint expands. And so this shapes what the Taliban can do on the ground, and their hesitation over the last 18 months to directly engage U.S. troops, because they didn't want to create a demand on the part of the American public to increase that presence there. But the broader point is, even those 2,500 troops mattered for the domestic political order in Afghanistan,
That's my point.
the command of the skies, and was absolutely vital to the structure of the state in terms of its capacity to maintain a coercive apparatus that could protect the government. And once you pull that little piece, everything else crumbled.
And that's the point of the critique, right? The critique, you got to get out of these forever wars, was that, look, it doesn't take, it's not the same as 100,000 troops. And so Crenshaw and others who argued, well, you just have to have a small provisional force. That was what was wrapped up in that whole argument, right?
And it's also important to realize that the United States does this all around the world.
Yes.
And when we talk about imperialism and ask the question, is the United States an empire, we're going to discuss a short version of a recent book by Daniel Immerwahr called The Hidden Empire of the United States. And his argument is that the United States has been doing this for well over 100 years. We have this overseas networks of military bases that allows the United States, that create an empire for the United States and allows the United States to shape local political outcomes. We saw this in Afghanistan, we saw it in Iraq, we saw it in Syria. But this has happened in Germany after World War II. The U.S. still has troops there. Japan, South Korea. So the larger point is this is not new in terms of how the U.S. has managed and shaped the content of the larger global political order since 1945.
And the point here is also that when you take it away, there's consequences. That served a lot of purposes that are not going to be served then when you take away that presence.
So let's talk more. That's kind of the historical lead up, and we've talked a little bit about the role that military power plays in this, but let's get into more kind of the military foundations of U.S. leadership, because the larger...
It's extensive.
Yes.
I mean, it's huge.
The statistics are staggering in terms of how far the United States is ahead of the rest of the world in terms of raw military capabilities. But this military power is important because it allows the United States to threaten to use military force to protect its borders, to protect its civilians, and to protect its allies. And it has this also extensive network of overseas military bases that allow the United States and ease the burdens associated with projecting military force and intervening to stabilize a government or respond to a terrorist attack if necessary. And so we see the United States here. This gives you some sense of all the countries that have extensive troop deployments of the United States around the world. It's a large number of countries. And we can think of Afghanistan in these terms, right? And we just mentioned this. The Afghan military was willing to fight against the Taliban as long as the U.S. had its own troops stationed there. What did our military do? It provided air power, training, coordination, intelligence. It took care of the military hardware and maintained the helicopters, and the planes. And once the U.S. left, the maintenance operations, that infrastructure went away. And the Afghan army essentially
Stunningly quickly.
disintegrated.
Yeah.
Because there wasn't this central coordinating device. And this is a microcosm of this conversation that we've had about the U.S. as the indispensable nation, right? And that indispensability is often a coordinating function. So the partnership between Afghanistan and the U.S. military was really critical to the domestic political order in Afghanistan that kept the Taliban out of power. So this underscores how important U.S. military power, this example to the global political order that defines states, helps set the composition of interests, of governments that rule them, and the size of spheres of influence held by great powers around the world. And so let's talk now, get in more specifically about the U.S. military to give you some sense about how much it outsizes other countries around the world.
All the countries combined.
Yeah.
I mean,
So the United States spends, and I think this is the projected number under the Biden administration, about $780 billion a year on the military. The U.S. spends more on national defense than the next 10 countries. If we ranked all countries around the world from 1 to 200 or whatever, the U.S. spends more than numbers 2 through 11 combined.
yeah. I mean, and this includes huge countries
China,
with formidable
Russia,
militaries. China and Russia.
And India, yes.
Right. I mean, they have lots of troops. They have nuclear weapons. They have everything, but they don't have it in the quantity and sophistication that the United States has.
Yes. This military power extends really to dominance across all domains: air power, naval power. We think about naval power in terms of aircraft carriers, the ability to project, that create then the ability to project air power around the world. They don't have to be tied to U.S. bases, and nuclear weapons. And the other thing that's significant here, and I'll post a link to this after class today. There's a really good article by Adam Tooze in the New Statesman a couple of days ago that talks about kind of shift and reorientation within the Pentagon after 2014. And the argument there is that the Pentagon is now in a tight relationship with Silicon Valley, pursuing technological dominance in terms of military hardware, because it recognizes that in terms of raw economic power, China is eventually going to surpass the United States.
In terms of number of troops and then quantity.
Well, in terms of
billion.
no, in terms of national economy, right? So eventually, and that
Economic part.
yeah, and that creates the aggregate base from which military power is drawn on, a portion of that economic wealth. And China has a significant, and will have a significant manpower advantage, in part because of the huge population differences between the two. But the Pentagon believes that the U.S. can always maintain technological dominance, which will allow U.S. military power to become more efficient and to be at the cutting edge of new military technologies and stay ahead of all of its competition. So what this has meant is the Pentagon is tightening its relationship with Silicon Valley, and it's moving and pressuring the government and private enterprises to get the supply chain for high-tech goods out of China. So it can't be disrupted in future competitions.
This is why Taiwan is so important
Yes.
too, right? Because of technology.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely, and the semiconductor industry in Taiwan, and why we could see growing tension between the U.S. and China over Taiwan. All right, so that's the military side. Let's move to talking about the economic side and economic leadership, and this is really important as well. So the United States, at least by average income, is by far the wealthiest economy in the world. If you look at that slide right there, that's a slide from the textbook, module 31, I believe, and all the countries in red are the countries with average income of over $50,000. That's a small list of countries.
So us and Norway.
Yes.
And,
So why is this income important? And there might be one or two Gulf states in there. Because this provides the aggregate resource base for military spending, foreign aid, a dynamic technological base that allows the U.S. military to generate new technologies that increase the efficiency by which it uses military force. The other thing that's really important here, and the Twos article that I mentioned is going to go over this, and his response to people that are worrying about U.S. decline is that the U.S. is still the dominant financial power in the world because the dollar is the primary medium of exchange. U.S. Treasuries are the principal source of global liquidity, and the U.S. has the deepest financial markets in the world. This means that the United States and the U.S. banking system has huge leverage over global finance. And in the case of, we're seeing this in the case of the Taliban today, is that when the Taliban takes over, the U.S. government freezes all of the Taliban's financial assets in banks around the world. And so right now, the Taliban doesn't have access to hard currency. This is a source of leverage because it can't pay its people, it can't pay its military, it can't provide public goods. That's a problem for governance. But humanitarian concerns are now emerging that there are significant poverty and emerging food crises in Afghanistan because the Taliban doesn't have access to money that's locked up in Western banks. And so there's going to be some pressure
It's a trade-off.
put on the United States to ease some of the flow of resources to the Taliban. And I think the congressional hearing yesterday talked about this, and the response was, well, we're going to give the money to NGOs so it stays out of the hands of the Taliban. All right, so now let's go to the next slide and talk about the political foundations of U.S. leadership. And this is really, and this gets us to NATO, and this is going to get us closer to our transition about what does all this mean for contemporary relations between the United States and Europe. So another fundamental foundation of U.S. leadership is, we're going to call here political foundations, and we're going to think about this dense network of alliance relationships, particularly among democratic states. And
We have rich friends.
We have rich friends, but we also have lots of friends, right?
Yeah.
And we see all the members of NATO there. And this also distinguishes, say, U.S. leadership and a world led by the United States from a potential world led by China. China doesn't have the same network of alliance relationships, neither does Russia, that the United States has. What this means is, if it comes to a great power conflict, the United States is going to be more likely to have powerful, wealthy countries join in its side, so long as the U.S. can sustain these alliance relationships. But now Afghanistan is raising some questions about that. So,
and that's why it's so important to talk about this fallout internationally. I mean, there is this sort of
you can take the slide off there.
There is this sort of knee-jerk reaction, like, well, this is up to us. We were shouldering all the burdens in Afghanistan. If we want to get out, we're going to get out. And if Europe doesn't like it, well, you go in. It's not that simple, right? Because all of these issues and all of these elements of U.S. hegemony and power are tied together, and they could come unraveled if one part starts to decay. And a lot of it is psychological, too. I mean, the United States and its power and its power projection sends signals that then other states react to and sort of don't try to confront it. And that will change as a different perception.
Can I give a parallel to what you just talked? I mean, think about how the stock market is priced. When people are buying a stock, they're making projections about what's the value of the stock. It's not what's the value now, it's what's the value of the stock going to be a year from now. Same thing's going on in the global political order. The rest of the world is using policy decisions now and elections now in the United States to make assessments about where's the U.S. going to be in 5 years or 10 years.
Right.
And this is why when we get to the end of class, when we talk about public opinion, why public opinion and what it's telling us about support for Biden and support for withdrawal tell us about American leadership.
Right, because, I mean, this is a good analogy, because what analysts always say is, well, the stock market already priced in this crisis, right? Europe and the rest of the world is pricing in this withdrawal.
Yes. And that's part of the tension right now and the uncertainty. I like that, pricing. That's a good one.
See, I know economy. Again, to summarize, we want to emphasize here the central role played by the U.S. military and its political and economic leadership in establishing the larger structure of international relations. This global political order relies on and is shaped extensively by U.S. power and a series of military, political, economic commitments that the United States has made to many governments around the world over decades, right? And so when the United States alters these commitments, as it has recently done with Afghanistan, then it has at least two important consequences. First, it can trigger a revision of the current local political order, often through violence. And this is what we see unfolding in the Afghan situation. This can mean that governments fall or a civil war breaks out. Alternatively, a different external power might intervene to set up a government in power that then becomes a new adversary to U.S. interests. And so what happened in Syria when the United States sort of pulled out of that and Russia moved in, changed everything. And it wasn't the same as a domestic breakdown. Syria didn't fall apart because Russia stepped in the absence of the United States. And so we see this potential for domestic political change in Afghanistan right now. Second, when the United States alters its commitments to one state, it can lead to a reassessment by all other U.S. allies about the durability of their relationship with the United States. And so these kinds of questions about, well, what's the United States going to do with its commitment to us are being asked in Europe right now. And so President Biden proclaimed that the United States was back when he took over as president. And this implied that the United States would have a renewed commitment to multilateralism and U.S. support for democracy. But has it really been the case that the United States is back if the United States withdraws from a long-term commitment like Afghanistan? That's the questions that are being asked. So here is a list of important questions that are now being asked in public debates inside and outside of the United States about what the last month has meant for U.S. leadership in the world. First, does U.S. withdrawal reflect a deeper U.S. decline and reordering of global politics in favor of China? You have countless op-eds out there debating this question. Second, surrendering the sphere of influence in Afghanistan, what does that mean for other great powers in the region? Will some other great power move in to replace the United States? And many speculate that that could be China. It's in its neighborhood, after all, roughly speaking. The U.S. public has supported this pullback, and it is looking increasingly isolationist, or at least reluctant to engage in these sort of boots on the ground interventions that the United States undertook in the wake of the 9/11 attacks. And arguably, it's going to be hard for any president to pull such a reluctant public along if there's some sort of need for a bold foreign policy adventure in somewhere around the world that faces a crisis. And so all the countries are going to ask themselves, so if push comes to shove, if something really needs to happen, will the United States be able to engage and intervene if the mass public just doesn't support that kind of action any longer? And then finally, the question is, what happens to other spheres of U.S. influence, other alliance relationships? What happens to NATO? What happens to U.S. military presence in South Korea or places like that? And so these are the big questions that surround this withdrawal of Afghanistan. So it wasn't just, getting out of Afghanistan, good idea, bad execution, boy, that didn't work out as well as we hoped, the end. There's this whole larger debate out there that we're going to be talking about for the rest of the time. And so The next thing we're going to do is we're going to examine some of the issues that we just brought up from a clip from Fareed Zakaria's GPS on CNN. And he's a great analyst. I really like Zakaria here. And it provides a discussion of why some NATO members have opposed the withdrawal from Afghanistan. So let's roll that clip now.
On October 7th, 2001, U.S. forces began to bomb Afghanistan to try to defeat both al-Qaeda and the Taliban. The British were by their side, led by then Prime Minister Tony Blair. He released just a blistering statement yesterday that began like this, quote, "The abandonment of Afghanistan and its people is tragic, dangerous, unnecessary, not in their interests and not in ours." It then went on to get even more critical of the U.S. decision, arguing, quote, "Anyone given commitments by Western leaders will understandably regard them as unstable currency." I want to speak now to Rory Stewart. He walked across much of Afghanistan in 2002, from Herat all the way to Kabul. He is a former member of the British Parliament. Rory, it's good to have you on. Few people have as much on-the-ground experience, face-to-face experience with Afghanistan as you have. You see the criticism there from Tony Blair. He says the U.S. not only abandoned Afghanistan, but in effect abandoned the U.K. as an ally, doing this without consultation. Do you agree?
Yes, and it's been very disturbing and humiliating for the UK because, of course, we woke up to this situation and it's embarrassing. Essentially, Britain believes very strongly, our defense secretary said that he thinks it's the wrong decision. He tried at the last moment to cobble together a coalition with the Italians and the Turks and others, struggled to do so. But essentially the problem is that the US has created over many decades a situation where the US leads in and the US leads out, and it hasn't really developed the idea that Britain and its other allies are going to have to develop a totally independent structure. These structures are very, very dependent on American command and control, American air power. And I think one of the things that's going to come out of this is nations like Britain are now going to have to think about how we develop a fully independent capability and begin disengaging ourselves from the US strategic framework.
That is just a remarkable and sobering assessment, because you'll remember that was the fear under Donald Trump among many Republicans and Democrats here, frankly, but many people currently advising the Biden administration. And part of the intention of President Biden was to reverse that, to recommit the U.S. to its NATO allies, to say we will be there for you. You're saying that this decision renders that difficult to believe?
Yes, it's very, very sad. I mean, the British government reached out to the US government on Sunday. Prime Minister Boris Johnson, requested a telephone call. He didn't receive a call from President Biden until halfway through Tuesday, which was already 3 days into this crisis in Kabul. And that was just indicative of the way in which this has all been conducted. The US from the beginning hasn't really believed it needs to have the courtesy of consulting. President Biden, having made the decision to withdraw, did not really try to reach out and work out whether Britain, France, Germany, Turkey, and others could take up the slack and replace the US in Afghanistan or provide the enablers to do that. He could have done, but I fear there's something very strange going on in the way President Biden's approached this. It's as though he's decided that if he thinks it's not worth his while, he's not going to give any assistance to anyone else for them to do it instead.
Remarkable, remarkable. We're joined now as well by Andrei Kortunov. He's the Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council, a think tank in Moscow. Of course, I don't have to remind you that Russia had its own debilitating withdrawal from Afghanistan going back to 1980. I want to know what signal Russia and the Kremlin take from the U.S. withdrawal. Do they read this as saying that the U.S. will not or is reluctant to defend allies abroad?
Well, I think that the U.S. withdrawal was anticipated in Moscow, but the exact posture, the speed at which the United States decided to withdraw from Afghanistan and the whole operation was, of course, a surprise. I think that it is clearly a present to those who believe that the United States continues to be on decline and that all this talk about multilateralism is nothing more but a talk. So, of course, it raises the issue of credibility of the United States as a strategic ally. But at the same time, it means that the challenge of Afghanistan has been passed from global powers to regional players. So Russia should take a part of responsibility for what's going on in the country or what is going on around the country, of course, together with other players like China and Pakistan, and arguably Iran and major Central Asian allies of the Russian Federation.
All right, so we want to highlight a number of things from this clip, and we'll just ignore how all the questions were quite leading and had an axe to grind. But anyway, let's begin with the Blair criticism, who's the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, strongly defended President George W. Bush, both in the decision to go to war in Afghanistan in 2001 and then the war in Iraq in 2003, right? And now he's proclaiming that everyone around the world will doubt future commitments from Western countries, but when he's talking about Western countries, what he really means is the United States. He feels like the U.S. broke promises to Afghanistan, but this clip also suggests that the British feel like they've been left out, that the U.S. broke its promise to them with respect to this partnership. And the concern is that the UK is embarrassed here because Biden left them in the lurch. There is the stuff about didn't communicate, didn't talk with Boris Johnson in the final days. But the other thing to realize here, and part of this backstop, is that part of the embarrassment is the lingering public criticism in the United Kingdom of its government for having tied itself so closely to the United States after 9/11.
Yeah, I mean, coming from Blair, a lot of people discount this because it's, you know, he was the chief architect of the UK's involvement in Afghanistan, and it wasn't very popular. And so there's not the idea that, you know, there's this thronging majority in the UK that says, I wish we were still in Afghanistan is hard to believe, right? But, you know, of course, Tony Blair, having built his whole political career in a way, or at least have it hoisted on him, of this tie with Bush on the intervention in Afghanistan, is going to feel like, oh, this is a huge mistake. That makes sense, but...
The other thing that I think is really interesting in this conversation, and gets back to our prior conversations about U.S. leadership and our conversation on the first day of class about the structure of international politics, because what the MP is also complaining that the United States has fostered a structural situation in which its allies are dependent on it. He suggests that some British wanted to stay in Afghanistan, some parts of Europe wanted to stay in Afghanistan, but they couldn't because they didn't have sufficient capabilities to execute their mission there. They need U.S. power and they need U.S. command and control. And again, that's kind of odd because, right, they have
Whose fault is that?
Yes. You know, what government made those decisions to rely on U.S. leadership and U.S. command and control? It allowed their allies not to make the same levels of investments. And so he's criticizing the structure of the situation, but it's important to recognize that the British government were also active participants in negotiating this order and allowed themselves and allowed their military to become dependent on U.S. military power in these situations.
Yeah, it's an interesting, though, I mean, it is just, again, another example of how unraveling this kind of structure is really difficult and can't be done very quickly, right? And that's, I think, something that, besides the, you know, it's a little ironic, like, you made us reliant on you. I mean, I'm resisting all my analogies to my kids. It's like, gimme. It's like, why don't you get it for yourself? Well, you always gave it to me, so you got to keep giving it to me. I mean, sorry, I did use that analogy.
Yeah. So you can go ahead and take the slide off. But let's talk about another point here that he makes and this is more significant in the context of let's move away from the political blame game and more significant to the future of NATO. And there's this argument that the United Kingdom should disengage, needs to create an autonomous separate force. And this is part of the larger debate in Europe now. In the second, we're going to talk about how the head of NATO, the NATO Secretary General, came out and criticized that last week in a public statement that basically defended Bush. But the concern is that if Europe decides to go its own way, this will lead to an unraveling. And what the British member of parliament was saying, former member of parliament, is we don't have a choice because we've now been exposed as being too dependent on the United States. And so for our own self-interested reasons, we need to shoulder more of these responsibilities. And the other thing I want to point out here, can you bring that back for a second, is the other thing that's challenging here, right? So there are some political leaders in Europe that want to go back in, but politically that was going to be costly for them to do because their voters are then going to say, wait a minute, why are you going to go back in if the U.S. isn't in? And they don't want, those European politicians don't want to be viewed by their voters as carrying the U.S.'s water here, as covering for the U.S. unwillingness to maintain the force posture in Afghanistan.
Well, they'd be kind of faced with the same situation that President Trump and the United States presidents have always argued. It's like, why are we doing this when so-and-so isn't willing to do it, right?
Yeah.
And it would be a different roles played. Europe would be asking itself, like, why are we shouldering this when the United States has pulled out?
Let's skip the stuff on Russia and then...
It's just Russia wants to move in.
And raises questions about the U.S. alliance or about U.S. commitments. And this brings us into talking about NATO. And so let's go up and put that next slide up. And so Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, last week responded to many of these criticisms about the Biden administration's withdrawal, its supposed lack of communication with its European allies. And what he attempted to do was paper over some of these differences. He publicly confirmed that NATO had been consulted by the Biden administration and NATO had approved of the withdrawal back in April of this year. Stoltenberg said, he disagreed with the manner in which withdrawal was going to be conducted. What he wanted was a conditional withdrawal. So on the basis of we want to see some concessions from the Taliban, some restraint on Taliban, and then we will progressively withdraw U.S. and NATO forces. And he wanted to do that to keep leverage over the Taliban. And the Biden administration said, no, we made a decision for withdrawal. We've got to honor our prior commitments. And so there was a little bit of disagreement within NATO over the process, but the Secretary General basically said, I didn't push for that once member governments decided in April that we're getting out. He also publicly opposes the creation of this new separate military force of European Union member states, this pursuit of autonomy that was discussed in the CNN video. And what he's concerned about is that this new European force could undermine NATO. And what he realizes is that we gave you the military spending numbers before. Well, 80% of the spending for NATO comes from countries outside of the European Union, Canada, the United States, and now the United Kingdom. So
mostly the United States.
Yes, mostly the United States. So this again means that the European Union is still heavily dependent on the United States for security. And this statement is really, he's trying to hold NATO together, paper over some of the differences, but it's clear that Afghanistan has provoked some real tension within the alliance.
It's interesting because, and I don't want to dwell on this too long, but Afghanistan, well, Iraq mostly, but those wars split NATO years ago, but in the reverse order. The United States was leading this charge to get into Iraq, and NATO allies were trying to restrain the United States to no avail, and that really meant some splits within NATO on those sorts of strategic things. And now the United States gets out of Afghanistan, and NATO's, there's splits within NATO because some member states, especially the UK, wants to stay in. Yeah. And so you just can't win. Okay, so now we want to move from talking about the international political consequences of U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan to the domestic political consequences. And there are some substantial ones. We're going to watch a quick clip here from the PBS NewsHour to get some sense of the broad national reaction to Biden's withdrawal policy. And note the tension here between widespread public support for U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan and harsh public opposition to the manner in which the withdrawal was executed. And so let's roll that clip now.
President Biden, in explaining the reason for leaving Afghanistan, said he didn't want to see any more bloodshed from young American men and women. And as much as the American people seem to agree with that, they are saying they don't like what happened here at the end. There was a new poll we did with, the NewsHour did with NPR and Marist, showing, 32% approval, 61, almost 2-to-1 disapproval. What do you make of this? What does it say about the country? How long lasting is this?
Well, I'll take that last question first. How long lasting will this disapproval be? And I don't think it will be long lasting at all. I think it's possible, and it is possible, to disapprove of the way the United States withdrew from Afghanistan while still supporting getting the troops out. There's a Washington Post poll that is out that actually lays this out quite perfectly. 77% of those surveyed support withdrawal from Afghanistan. But when asked, do you approve of the way the president has handled the withdrawal, only 26% said they approve. They support withdrawal, but they don't approve of the president's handling of it. And 52% disapprove of the handling of it, but they support the withdrawal. So that's why I say this is a momentary blip for the president.
And given the sacrifice they've made, Michael, and given what we're seeing of the American people and this, what on the surface looks to be contradictory, supporting pulling out but not liking the way it was done, what does that say about all of us?
Well, it's a complex viewpoint. I mean, the public is perfectly capable of holding those two ideas at the same time. I agree with Jonathan about the long-term effect of Afghanistan itself. This is a policy people agree with. And that is, I think, ultimately going to, redound to the president's benefit. He will campaign if he runs for re-election as the ender of forever wars. He will do that. I think that's absolutely true. The problem is if this becomes a data point in an impression of incompetence, because right now the American people view that retreat from Afghanistan as not competent very strongly. I don't think it's Afghanistan that would be the problem. I think it's a set of data points that would hurt him in the long run.
All right, so let's talk about this clip by first reviewing the underlying polls that they were discussing. And so first, it's important to note that there is widespread public support for withdrawing U.S. forces from Afghanistan. And so 78%, so there's very few issues that get 78% approval anymore, right? But 78% of voters approved of this decision to withdraw all U.S. forces from Afghanistan. Only 17% of the electorate said they wanted to stay the course and keep some U.S. troops in. So that's a huge gap. Arguably then, this is a small d democratic decision by Biden. President Biden gave the people what they wanted. They wanted an end to the war in Afghanistan. And it's really interesting. I've had a lot of private discussions with people, and there's a lot of these, like, nope, he was right. He was right, and then but, right? And it's important to note, though, that there is still a partisan divide here. Democrats were more likely to favor full withdrawal of troops than Republicans. 89% of Democrats wanted completely out, while 76% of Republicans wanted out. But 76% of Republicans wanting out, to me, is a huge number. He wasn't wrong on that half of it. But the second thing to note here that is held at the same time is, despite the national consensus on the end result of the policy decision that it was right to fully withdraw, there was widespread frustration with the manner in which the withdrawal was executed. And so over 50% of voters disapprove of how the Biden administration handled the withdrawal. And that is the middle part of the figure you see now, right? And as you can see, there's a wider partisan split on the execution question. 68% of Republicans opposed how President Biden handled the withdrawal, but only 37% of Democrats opposed the administration's execution of the withdrawal. And so then third, this leads Capehart and Gerson, the discussants there, to argue that about the long-term domestic consequences of this decision, which is now viewed as sort of a policy failure by the U.S. government. Now, the question is, will it hurt President Biden and the Democrats? And they're skeptical that it will hurt in the long run, although Gerson suggests something could become a more significant data point in a larger narrative about administrative incompetence. And this is some things I read, and there was two sort of values that President Biden really projected when he ran for office, right? Was competence, that he was going to be a competent leader and manager, and the other was empathy. And in both of those, he seemed to have fallen short because he didn't seem to be very competent in executing this withdrawal, and there was a lot of issues and people left behind, et cetera. And then also he stuck to his guns so hard that it looked like he didn't care as much as he seemed to care about other people in tragic situations, especially the Afghans who were left behind. And so that could hurt Biden. And they also argue that Biden needs to get a win here, right? He needs to limit future policy mistakes. And the fourth point we should make here is that the public support for Biden has clearly declined over the last month. And so he is paying a cost. Public approval from earlier was 52%. So it fell from 52% in April to 44% approval in early September. That's a pretty big drop. And now it's underwater, so to speak. And that means that more people disapprove than approve of Biden for the first time in his young presidency. And some of this is because of the resurgence of COVID-19 and the Delta variant, but a lot of it is surrounding this issue with Afghanistan. And the larger issue that we need to understand in this class here is that international is the whole sort of collection here. International events, what's going on in Afghanistan, have real domestic consequences for U.S. citizens and internally in this country. In this case, what happened internationally is hurting the standing and political capital of the president and could ultimately shape what the composition of the Congress looks like in the midterms, which sort of right around the corner in 2022. All
right, so we want to conclude today. This means the quiz is coming up ready.
Yeah,
so turn off your YouTube if you're not really listening to us. Get ready. But anyway, to conclude, get logged in by talking about what all this means for what this means for the U.S. position in the world and the larger global political order. First, democracy matters. We had this question last week. And I mean, one of the reasons that Biden pulls back, in part because, on the one hand, he disagreed with the surge back in 2009. He thought President...
He personally felt committed to this.
Yes,
right.
And he thought President Obama got steamrolled by the military, and he wanted to make sure that he wouldn't do that again. But he was also responding to where the American public was at, and it's clear that the U.S. public said enough. It's time to bring the troops home, and that we don't view what's going on in Afghanistan as a vital national interest that is worth risking the lives of American soldiers now. So this means democracy, the voting public wants a pullback. And it also suggests that U.S. voters have less support for an ambitious forward military posture
things have changed
around the world. Yes. And this has been going on, I think, and we'll talk about this later, this is some of it in our grand strategy debate. I would date this to 2008. The beginning of this broader questioning about globalization and multilateralism, but the Trump administration really accelerates this debate in the U.S. and helps to bring more political support for a pullback of the like that we're seeing right now, particularly within the Republican Party. Right. Now, this is going to be a challenge for President Biden because on the one hand, he declared that the U.S. is back, but it doesn't look like the voters necessarily support that, at least in the case of Afghanistan. We'll have to look at other issue areas. So it might be hard for him to ultimately sustain those pledges. Think about this in terms of the Paris Climate Accord. And the rest of the world is going to notice this. This could ultimately create doubt about future commitments, which aren't necessarily based about what the president is doing on a daily basis, and instead rooted in assessments of where the American electorate is going.
Right.
And it looks like the American electorate is moving away from broadly internationalist.
The question that just popped into my head is, what else is the American public not willing to do, right? And so it's pretty obvious. I mean, and then I liked how you dated it back to 2008. I mean, now we have two presidents, right? Obama and Donald Trump, who ran and won on an anti-war kind of, an anti-intervention kind of platform. And so that this has been coming. But, think about the hard choices and real sacrifices that would really be involved in a dramatic climate change agenda. Like, who's really down for that? I mean, I keep trying to convince myself to get an electric car, but there's times like I don't know if I can take. I don't know if I can do it.
I want the F-150 Lightning. That looks like a cool truck. I'm telling you. I'm on board there.
About
I'm from Minnesota, right? There's nothing wrong with the truck.
But that's the question: is what kind of leadership can the United States provide when it is going to be hard?
Okay.
And that's an ongoing question.